Well, welcome to Father and Son, and welcome to you, Tom.
Morning, Dad.
Tuesday morning. Well, amazing turn in the election, I thought. I think Ted Baillieu's done brilliantly over the last 5 or 6 days. He's got all the headlines, good policies on the trains and other matters. But the surprising thing, they had a very good launch, whereas the launch that's going on for the Labor Party today got a small paragraph on about page 5 of the Herald Sun. And I think what was staggering, though, is that the Liberal Party have decided to give their preferences to the Labor Party ahead of the Greens, which has destroyed the Greens' chance of getting any lower house seats. They might still get Melbourne, but it's still very unlikely, and they won't be holding the balance of power. And Jeff Kennett was very interesting today in the newspaper when he said, I don't think I could have made the same decision. I would have given it the other way around, but Ted Baillieu is thinking much more about Victoria and less about his own party, as he always has, because he wants stable government in Victoria. So it'll either be Labor or Liberal.
Yes, I read that both Kennett and former Federal Treasurer Peter Costello had both thought that preferencing the Greens was a good idea because anything that hurt Labor was good. But I agree with you. I think, one of the reservations, or that's too weak a word, one of the criticisms many voters of whatever side of politics they support don't like about their parties is their parties don't seem to stand for anything anymore. I mean, one thing about the Greens that I think is helping their popularity is, you don't want to look at all their policies, but basically
most of them are idiots.
Well, maybe they are, but people say, well, at least I know what they stand for.
Yeah.
Whereas if you look at Liberal and Labor...
Us going into bankruptcy, the state going into bankruptcy.
Well, they seem to believe that too. But if you look at Liberal and Labor, to be honest, if you compare policies on health and public transport and this and that, it all just looks like a bit of a bidding war. I'll spend this much on this, and we'll get that many beds in this hospital.
I think that's unfair.
Well, look, I would challenge...
Labor has been in government for 11 years, and there's huge problems in the health system, big problems in public transport, big increase in crime, and education is not in great shape. So.
Yes, but I think if you were to go, I guarantee you, if you were to pick 100 people off the street and say, okay, explain the differences between Liberal and Labor policies and all these issues, they're all questions of degree. Will it be one policeman on the train station or two? Will it be daylight hours or just at night time? You know what I mean? And it's difficult at a state level to have big ideological differences. But what I was going to say is this. I think Ted has done the right thing by saying, you know what, if the Liberal Party stands for something, it is pretty much not most of what the Greens stand for. Therefore, we cannot in good conscience preference the Greens, even though that probably in some ways helps Labor and helps in a Melbourne Labor candidate. So I think it's a good move. I agree with you.
So do I. I think the latest polls that have been coming out are showing that people now think Ted is closer to the people's problems. And the one thing that Labor's struggling about is they have been there 11 years and yet they're telling you that we've got all these problems, which the Liberals are telling you. So I think they're starting to head for a very good chance of a Liberal victory.
Well, that's right. I mean, look, a lot of local issues are going to come up, and more so than in federal elections. In state elections, people do vote along local lines. Will there be a bus route here? Is there a hospital in the electorate, and that sort of thing.
And the local member looking after
people
when they write letters and things.
And being approachable. In fact, I used to work for a member of parliament. Actually, was a federal member 20 years ago now, and I must say that the weekly what we called surgeries, where honestly anybody could just come in and complain about something, and to be honest, if we could, we tried to help. Yep. The Liberals were in opposition back then, but that was something that I thought was actually a very valuable service. I mean, people need to think that their member of parliament was approachable. You never ask them who they voted for or anything like that, because you represent all the people in your electorate. But look, I think this election will be close. I still think the Greens will get 1 or 2 seats in Melbourne, and the reason is this. Remember, we are talking with preferences. We're talking about simply how the how to vote card is written. And as you pointed out the other day, a lot of inner city people who tend to read the Age newspaper will often make up their own mind about preferences anyway. And I guarantee you there'll be a lot of Liberal supporters who will preference the Greens ahead of Labor.
Yeah, but in the end, for the Greens to get over, they need those Liberal preferences.
Yes.
And they need their own primary vote. Now, the fact that there will be a strong leakage because the ticket will give the Liberal preference to Labor, I think it'll get them over the line.
I guess I'm disagreeing and saying that I think a lot of people will ignore the how to vote card in some of those seats.
Well, they may. We'll wait and see.
Now, speaking of other issues close to the Greens, the Prime Minister's banging on about climate change over at the G20 meeting in Yokohama in Japan. And it's interesting because, I mean, the Americans, as a result of the midterm congressional elections, Congress is now dominated by Republicans, and in particular far-right Republicans in the form of the Tea Party, have essentially said they're not going to do anything on climate change now. And yet here's Julia Gillard at a meeting dominated by the Americans saying we're going to push ahead with it. And what's interesting is that, quite rightly, the government has said, well, whatever action we take, whether it's a carbon tax or whatever, we will submit it to the Productivity Commission for analysis.
That's it.
And yet, curiously, at the same time, the $43 billion national broadband network is not to be submitted to the same scrutiny because presumably it wouldn't stand up.
I think that's right, and I think it's interesting. I heard our local member, the man who's got the seat of Melbourne in the federal parliament, saying we, the Greens, are going to put them to the test here. They're not going to support the NBN. They first of all want the budget brought out. They've done that. And they're now talking about holding that back till after the House retires next week. But they're also saying, and the Senate's saying, we need you to put it to the Productivity Council. What happens, I'm not sure.
Well, that's right. But I mean, the thing is, any really large expenditure of money should be subject to some sort of analysis. Now, not everything has to go to the Productivity Commission, but the NBN is one of the biggest government projects outside of defence that's been attempted for quite some time. And to just say, well, we'll spend 40 odd billion. I mean, they say they're going to raise some for the private sector, but the potential returns at the moment don't appear to justify that. So I think there's going to be more pressure, and it's interesting that Gillard appears to be slipping in the polls federally a fair bit because I think the government.
Indecisive.
Well, I think the government's being hoisted by its own petard. I mean, having done a deal with people like Oakeshott and Windsor from New South Wales on one hand, and of course the Greens on the other hand, they're finding that they actually can't get much done, which may not be a bad thing for the rest of us.
Probably quite good.
There
was something interesting in the Australian, just changing the subject this morning, about, and they're talking about trying to change the banking system and make credit cheaper. And there was a good article on the front page of the Australian which said that they're going to introduce these new bonds. The banks will be able to do it, and they'll be able to use the customer deposits as security for them, which means they'll be able to raise a lot more money locally, and that will, according to the pundits, bring interest rates down on mortgages. What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, if there was a magic way of reducing interest rates, we'd do it. The weird thing is, the Reserve Bank wants interest rates to go up, and it's probably quite pleased at what the big banks have done. They probably knew that the big banks, that is, if the Reserve Bank went up by 25 bips, the big banks would go up by more. So for the government to say, well, let's think of a way to get interest rates down at a time when the Reserve Bank wants them up, to me seems a silly policy. You've got the monetary policy on one hand doing one thing, the Reserve Bank, you've got the government trying to do a different thing. That's not right. Policies work best when they're coordinated, as they were during the global financial crisis.
Well, in this instance, you've got both the coalition and the Labor government both wanting to put pressure back.
Oh, I agree. They both want it, but I'm saying I think it's a done thing. The Reserve Bank has made it clear. I mean, if we believe in the Reserve Bank, if we think the politicians should be setting interest rates, well, let's get rid of the Reserve Bank and go back to having Canberra doing it directly. But I'll just say this. Let's just say, like a lot of people think we already have a runaway housing market in terms of prices in this country. What do you think is going to happen to house prices if the government achieves its purported aim of cutting interest rates again? They'll go up more. So if you think we have a housing crisis now, it will get worse. So I just think that the law of unintended consequences has to be considered here before the government does something silly to try and reduce rates dramatically. I don't see rates going down for some time.
Okay, well that's about all for this week. We'll talk about the election again next week. We'll be that much closer. Don't forget to watch Tom and I on 3AW at 12 noon next Sunday, where we do Father and Son on the radio. And we'll probably have Gary Morgan, who'll just have a new poll out in the election to talk to.
Look forward to it.